This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News. This is Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Brussell. Mae, I know you've got enough material here for a 5-hour program today, and we'll try to get into it as quickly as possible, but now that we're broadcasting at a new date and new time, there's every possibility that you have some new listeners. Maybe we should spend just a minute or two establishing the premise of the program and letting the people know what it's all about. The regular listeners, I know, are right up to date with you. But the premise of the program is that...
Well, the premise of the program, Bob, is to show that there are murders in this country, political assassinations, taking place systematically, that they're not isolated homicides. That is the first purpose of the show. And the second is to show how these murders are concealed from the population in the United States and around the world, or how they try to conceal them through mishandling of evidence or planning evidence and controlling of the news media. And the third purpose I have in my research is to say that these murders, such as that of John Kennedy or Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, are not isolated murders that do not affect today's headlines, so that in the show each week I try to bring newspaper articles, preferably from the morning that we do the show, to show how our lives are affected by today's headlines through the killing of these men, that certain persons have power today to affect changes in our life.
And you do assert that on that tragic November 22nd day in Dallas, Texas, our government was literally overthrown.
Literally overthrown. Yes, more and more people who are doing research into the assassinations and the murders taking place are becoming extremely aware that it was a total military coup, which leaves us with three choices. If what I am saying is true, and if my research is accurate, it leaves the United States with three choices, and they're important because this is an election year and supposedly we do have choices. And the way I narrow it down is that we can, in the first place, become aware of the problem and get the government back into the hands of people other than that hidden government. John Kennedy referred to a hidden government behind my back, and he removed Allen Dulles from the CIA and other top officials, and Allen Dulles was put on the Warren Commission to handle all the evidence of the conspiracy after John Kennedy was murdered. I feel there is a shadow government, and this can be carefully documented in those 5 hours you talk about, or 10 hours, two governments running the front man and the back man, the front military system and the behind-the-scene military system, the president and the people who give the president orders, on down the line. And if you become aware of this problem, maybe through a group of intelligent young people growing up, young lawyers, scientists, citizens, students, politicians, they may separate the front man from the back man and do something. The other choice is to continue into a state of fascism. They're talking about lobotomies up at the prison system and isolation of the radicals. There's a very carefully designed way to take care of all protesters that will get tighter in 72, and fascism will get a stronger hold. The appointments to the Supreme Court are very serious. Mr. Powell and Mr. Rehnquist and Richard Nixon controls the minds of the court for all practical purposes now. And with fascism, then you get guerrilla warfare like Vietnam, which would take us into 30, 40, 50 years of endless guerrilla warfare in this country, because no group of people can hold us down with all their technology and surveillance. The people will rise up, but it'll be bloody. And then the third choice would be an eventual invasion from the third world, Russia and China, to free the citizens of the United States, like we went into Germany to free those people. And those are the only three choices I think we have now.
And that sort of thing is making headlines right now, this week. This past week, with the discovery of the bombs that were planted at various banks, three banks in Chicago, three in New York, three in San Francisco.
Yes, even on a world scale, it's
the guerrilla warfare that you referred to. It's already in progress.
Well, the guerrilla warfare, we could do, an hour show just on my documentation of that. But what we see now is that Japan is going to line up with the third world. They're turning their back, no matter how Richard Nixon entertains Mr. Sato. Japan sees Richard Nixon and America for what it is. The other nations are turning away from us. India said this week we have to take Asia into the hands of the Asians, turn our back on the United States. Trudeau is having a rift in Canada because they want to turn their back on their economic dependence upon the United States. All the major countries are going to line up. England joined the common market. They're all recognizing the rebuilding of the Nazi fascist cartel with Richard Nixon and the people in power today, and we will be isolated, as Germany eventually was, and everyone had to come in and free it from its fascism.
And this past week, India recognized North Vietnam. As far as Japan goes, the people, the man on the street and the press have always been, I won't say always, but have of recent years been violently anti-American. And now the business community is becoming so.
We're losing all of our friends because we have a government here that is trying to pull us back to the 19th century, and it just won't work. With radio, television, and information coming out and bombs falling on the heads, such as we're doing in North Vietnam now, the pounding they got just last night, is so horrendous, and the men talk peace, but we're not having peace, and the world recognizes it.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn Mae loose on you in just a moment, but first, I think one more thing that we ought to touch on for any new listeners we might have, and that is the scope of your research. Our regular listeners are aware of the vast amount of research that you've done. It's over 8 years' work.
Yes, it's 8 years' work, and a lot of people call in or write letters or call me and constantly want to know, where do you get your information? And I will say that my research began with government documents, and it stays with government documents, witness testimony before hearings, current trials that are legal lawsuits that are filed in Washington against the National Archives for access to information, or the file of James Ray's lawsuit that he says there's a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King he wants to tell, or there's a lawsuit in Los Angeles against the Attorney General of our state of California and the Chief of Law Enforcement, Robert Houghton. I stick with filed cases, legal suits, government documents, FBI reports, State Department papers, Secret Service reports, government interviews. Now, I do read newspapers. I take 8 a day. I used to take 60 magazines a month. I read them, borrow them, copy them from the library. I assimilate a lot of current literature and books on the related subjects. There's 109 books on the John Kennedy murder now. I have a library of 300 books or so on espionage systems, State Department papers and books, and they are not slanted right, left, or middle. Whatever comes out on a subject, I read whatever the author says, whoever he is. But my work began with the 26 volumes of the commission hearings on John Kennedy's murder.
The Warren Commission report.
The Warren Commission hearings.
Popularly known.
That is where I became knowledgeable on the working of the government. You know, it became such a scandal in June when the Pentagon Papers came out, and we found that our public officials on Meet the Press and in front of Congress and otherwise gave interviews and said one thing, and on paper they said something different. It's like this week in the newspaper where it was exposed that Mr. Kissinger says one thing on his policy of Pakistan, and his State Department memos and meetings at the National Security Council say something else. Well, I can understand that and not be shocked. The country's taken into shock by this double exposure because I've been studying double talk. Orwell calls it double think and double talk. I've been studying and documenting what the exhibits or documents said as against what the witnesses said, and witnesses were never tried for perjury. And this is where I came to the realization how much double talk there is.
Now, how about your political orientation? That's something that new listeners might want to have some background on.
What party I belong to?
Yes. What are your politics? Do you have an axe to grind in that area?
Well, I belong to the Mae Brussell party. I'm not really running for anything, and the cult of leadership or leading people on to one way or system is over. People are going to have to find it out for themselves, and the person running the government who deserves that power should represent what the people know and not what he promises them or lies about. I used to be a registered Democrat, and after the John Kennedy murder, and I realized what members of the Democratic Party had done to John Kennedy, I couldn't support that organization any longer, and I moved up to Carmel 7 years ago from L.A., and at the time, the Democratic Party called me and wanted me to help support Lyndon Johnson in '64, and I said, I don't support murderers or people associated with this crime until the truth is told. And they were horrified, and the Democratic people in Carmel have never had anything to do with me. If I walk down the street, they walk the other way. I would not be a Republican because they have not gone into the assassinations, and Richard Nixon is a presidential Republican, and the truth of his opponent of how Robert Kennedy was killed has never been exposed, so I don't recognize Richard Nixon as my president. I registered for Peace and Freedom, and I begged that party to go into truth because a branch of a political system that's new has a difficult chance of overthrowing the Republican Democratic Party right away, but if they consistently would stay with the truth, not only with the masses of people who want a better opportunity in this nation and fair shake, but if they would stick with the real truth of who usurped the power, I would stay there. But none of them that I've ever met, I've met the people in this state that have organized, have ever spoken publicly about the assassinations as being a military coup through the government. So I am not a political person. I belong to no party, and I will not support any party until that party promises to find out why we can't have all the evidence of all the political murders exposed right now.
And as far as supportive testimony or supportive evidence, were this a television show, why I could hold up for you the documents and the books and all that. KLRB would not have this program on the air were it not for the fact that Mae Brussell can document every statement she makes. So if in the course of this series you hear some statement that just sounds too outrageous for you to believe and you want to challenge Mae Brussell, do so.
I think you should give the mailbox again and the phone number, and I will call you back if they're busy here after the show. I have reached every person who's ever called in, and I've talked with them. You know, we've been on the air since June, and I've made a lot of close friends, personal friends, and I have a running correspondence with these people. And if something comes up in the news and they want to see, does this link in or tie in, they phone me. I'm never too busy. I'll answer their questions. I want to teach them. I don't want to tell you it happened. I want to show you how to see it. I have a lot of people in the area subscribing to the San Jose Mercury because it is a good paper, and there's a lot of information, more than the Chronicle, coming in. And I want to tell them about books. I've given the names of books and authors and documents. The Warren Commission hearings are at the library at Monterey Peninsula College. You can look up references and chapters. If I refer to them on the show, I will look up volume number and page number, or if I just refer to it without that reference, I'll go home and look it up. So if people have any question, I think they should take it as a education, as a public service in trying to explain the 60s and 70s.
And if you want to correspond directly with Mae Brussell, do so care of KLRB, Box 3904, Carmel, California. Our zip code is 93921. I'll give this address again at the end of the broadcast. If you want to speak to Mae Brussell, you call KLRB and leave your name and number. We get in touch with Mae, and then she'll call you back, and she really does.
Yeah, I brought one book in that I do think is very important, and in case anybody missed the other shows, they should write it down. And I tell them, get a pencil before the show starts, because you may want to write some of these things down. The book is called Inspection for Disarmament, and it's edited by Seymour Melman, and you can buy it from Columbia University Press. Your local bookstores will order it for you. I learned about it through the magazine Computers and Automation. They quoted the book, and I got it from my local bookstore. It was published in 1958. And it is the story of how Germany, after World War I, decided that they would not obey the Versailles Treaty. And they had a system of building up the German armament to the point where Hitler came into power. And it's the story of two governments, the accepted military and how we said, wind down your military, reduce your men, pull back your lines, and they obeyed. And all the time they armed and secretly build up a second army behind the first one that eventually through the election of the people, put in Adolf Hitler. And in the process of this rearmament of Germany from a defeated military position to almost ruling the world, they went through the process of killing 400 people. Well, they give a figure of 400 political people, leaders in the nation that were important, that they had to do away with, who could stop their rearmament or get wind of this secret government. And I bring this up because in my research I could read off, I brought a list today of people who have been systematically killed by this same group. And I think we'll go into that in a moment because we're talking about the past political murders. And Bob, I'd like to do maybe a television or radio first. This is a radio first. In predicting the murder of a man in California and documenting it today, based upon my research of the process that happened in Nazi Germany that was transferred through Reinhard Gehlen, chief of German intelligence, to Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, into our State Department, into our policies, which is happening today. So that if we have defeat in Vietnam, or if we had defeat in World War II, in the sense that we couldn't go on through and conquer Russia. See, we can.
Well, now, when you say Nazi, you're not like someone on the street screaming at another person, "You fascist pig," or something like that. You mean that literally? That
I mean von
Nazis...
Braun, the top Nazis from the Space Intelligence Agency, aerospace industry in the Southwest that own armament, munitions factories, a group that came in with the space, others are into munitions. I mean the German Nazis that came into the United States, and the chief of Nazi intelligence, Reinhard Gehlen, who was chief of all Nazi intelligence, worked with our OSS and Allen Dulles. He would meet in Switzerland, and when Hitler was defeated, he became part of the U.S. government espionage system and helped form the CIA. All the time that McCarthy was yelling about communists in the State Department, we were reconstructing the entire CIA with the help of Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief, and he gave us all of his agents behind the lines and everywhere and infiltrates them into this country today. And I hit upon this group of people in my research when I was cross-filing in the commission documents who were the people that Lee and Marina Oswald knew in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And all 28 of these people I could narrow down to coming into an intelligence type of operation, and it began, it took years of research to siphon out who these people were and who they were connected with and how our State Department really was formed.
So when people point out similarities between some of the things that are happening in this country as far as repression and government policy and all that, and what happened in Hitler's Nazi Germany, it's not coincidence.
Oh, it's not coincidence at all. And if you begin now to take a list of people who are dying off, and if you were really to go into the background of their murders, you would see a careful pattern. Like I did 8 years of intensive research on the John Kennedy murder, just on Oswald, the agent of the CIA. And in that process, Robert Kennedy, in the meantime, was killed, and Martin Luther King and other people. And the similarities between the way these murders affected the cover story, the getaway, the media control, led me to study superficially, not in intense research yet, many, many other murders. But Bernard Fensterwald, attorney in Washington who used to do research work for Kefauver, has a committee called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. And Bernard Fensterwald is a prominent attorney. He used to be Senate Crimes Investigating Committee chief. And he's writing a book on one chapter on each one of these murders now, on the murder of Walter Reuther. I have a list here I brought in that is comparable to the Nazi 400, and I might read it off. We have our president, John Kennedy, and then our candidate for presidency, Robert Kennedy. And the civil rights group, you have Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and Whitney Young. And the Black Panther, Fred Hampton, and Mrs. Pratt in Los Angeles, at least 28 of the top Panther leaders, Bobby Hinton, George Jackson, Ruben Salazar is the major assassination of the Mexican-American leaders down L.A. who is catching on. The political leaders, Lin Powell is a new victim of the East-West conflict, the man that Mao Zedong was to have succeed him. Adlai Stevenson, Dag Hammarskjöld, Patrice Lumumba. I'm rattling these names off, Bob, but there's a play that just opened on Broadway called Murderous Angels, on the murder of Dag Hammarskjöld and Patrice Lumumba and the link between them. And
well, you've linked all of these names
all of these
together.
all the time, yes. But this play just opened last week.
The same people were involved, the same organizations,
That's
the same methods were used. In other words,
They're all
what you're
linked.
asserting is that they are all linked.
They're all linked. And people have taken them as individual murders and not seen the link of Mr. DM and Mr. New. The Pentagon paper now says, the CIA was instrumental in killing this. But I have other names like Moshe Shambe, Abdel Nasser, Jacobo Guzman, who was the ex-president of Guatemala, Che Guevara, James Forrestal, and Mr. Kefauver. That's the close friend of Mr. Fensterwald, that he's investigating his murder. He was against the syndicate and the crimes, and he believes that was a political murder. And Joseph Colombo, again. And then Penn Jones in Texas has written 3 books. They're called Forgive My Grief, Volume 1, 2, and 3, on the murders of all the people associated with the John Kennedy assassination who had evidence of material that would change the effect of the minds of Americans if it ever came to trial. And those are people like David Ferry and Betty McDonald, Earlene Roberts, who had the rooming house where Oswald lived, or Mr. Whaley, the taxi cab driver, the bus driver, and Guy Bannister. And there's a whole link of 109 people so far just associated with the John Kennedy murder.
Dorothy Kilgallen.
And then you get into the family massacres, and this goes back to the book Inspection for Disarmament, that the way people voted for Hitler was that he was to restore order. And one of the ways the hidden government achieved what they wanted was through terror. And the massacres in Los Angeles, the Sharon Tate, the Biancas, the Dr. Oda massacre up in Santa Cruz, those were not done by Charles Manson or John Frazier. These are part of a system. This can be documented. We're throwing a lot out. It always is mind-blowing, but it is very important to see that researchers like myself across the country and writing for scientific magazines like Computer and Automation are putting all of these together, putting all of these murders together.
Yeah, we're covering a lot of ground here. To give you some background, in past programs, Mae has done individual hour-long programs on each of these and has given her supportive evidence. You didn't cover the area of music and entertainment.
Oh,
That's
no. The Monterey Pop came at the time that the Manson thing was to be created, where Charlie Manson was to get out of prison and be given money and associated with the syndicate and given a guitar and go on his so-called hippie trip. But the changing of America, the revolutionary change, really was symbolized in the Monterey Pop. And I guess I turned on to the big change because we live in the area and I'm sensitive to what was really happening. It reached all over the world. And I don't think that it is coincidental that people like Otis Redding, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Brian Jones, and others were not possibly included to come down, because after seeing the cold-blooded way that the Los Angeles massacre came down for the effect of trying to prove that hippies were doing that, I think it would be very important someday to go into the autopsies and get these bodies out and really check out what happened. A lot of them haven't had autopsies.
You've built a pretty solid case on the death of Marilyn Monroe also.
Yes, that is another story all in itself that has to do with Robert Kennedy. I don't think that murder was done by the intelligence operation that we're talking about, the network of that hidden government. I think that the hidden government has used that murder to blackmail people to effect social changes. And that's a little more complicated because, you see, along the way, there's a lot of people who make a lot of mistakes and sleep in a lot of the wrong beds. And the intelligence government keeps track of them. Through Army intelligence, and J. Edgar Hoover, that's one of his best hobbies, is tapping those bedrooms and keeping track of people like Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy. And then they affect political and social changes because these men want their power that they've built out through their own brains and intelligence, and they're blackmailed into positions where they can't use that power.
Okay, if we have your heads whirling now, at least this brings us more or less up to date and ready to start 1972. And almost every week we can depend upon Mae to blow our minds with some new bit of evidence, some new speculation, some new names and what have you. And the mind blower this week that you laid on me just before we went on the air concerned Cesar Chavez.
Yes.
Would you like to address yourself to that subject?
Well, when I go to the show each week to do this radio broadcast, I do like to take the news of the week that is pertinent to political assassinations and rap about that, because that is the thing that I know and study and document. And this last week there was in the newspaper an article An informer leaks a plot, a $30,000 payoff to murder Cesar Chavez. And I naturally was very interested in that because Mr. Chavez is a terribly important person in this state and in this country. And I believe seriously that this, I know that he has the documents of who would want to kill him. And I began to study the article like I do other articles on political assassinations, and I broke it down, and I'll read it to you. But while I was on this show since June again, people have come to me with phone calls of information on various murders or trials in the Manson case, in the Billy Smith thing, in the Oda Frazier thing in Santa Cruz. I've received calls from different places, and one other call, which was important, is a plan to murder some high-ranking generals out at Fort Ord through botulism, and we'll do a show on that. We never did discuss that. But another call I got was on an intention to kill Cesar Chavez, that somebody had information to kill him. Well, I received that information, and I had no way of getting to Chavez or to say it was true or untrue. So I wanted to sit on it for a while and see what was happening. When the article came out in the paper this week, I realized that, yes, there are people wanting to kill Cesar Chavez, and I realized that the murder plan would not be from a low-level plot, would be high-level, just like the murders we mentioned before, Bob. Now, for people who do not know why Mr. Chavez would be killed, I ran a little biography for him from the 1970 Almanac, New York Times Almanac, because he's important enough to be mentioned 2 times in that book, once under biography of famous people and once under the section on California. He's that important. He's one of the few people mentioned in the section on California. He is, in the first place, an important person in terms of labor, changing labor market, the economic policy in this country, the division of profits, higher wages, and labor people are controversial. Yablonsky was murdered, Walter Reuther was murdered. Chavez is equal, but he's greater than them.
Well,
and
anyone who has a profound effect on the economy in any way, shape, or form is treading on thin ice.
That's right. And I'm going to give 4 reasons why I think that the attempted murder of Chavez would be a high level, because these other men were murdered in the labor field, and Mr. Chavez is more important. The second thing is the growing awareness of the Mexican-American, that the United States government is having enough trouble with the awakening of the blacks to their inherent value as human beings and trying to handle their high IQs and their ability and all the skills after repressing them for 300 years. The brilliance of people like Eldridge Cleaver and George Jackson or Rochelle McGee, who are supposed to be the lowest level of our society. They're coming out on top. They are the thinking minds. James Baldwin, they are the men who are telling us where it's at in terms of poetry, of feeling, and
legal expertise. You mentioned
legal
Rochelle
expertise.
McGee.
Brilliant minds. I mean, we're not going to any of the known other talents, but we're going into it's a complete turnabout. And we're throwing out the whole idea of IQ tests and all kinds of things. This is another revolution, that is coming along, a social revolution. But not only is there the awareness of the blacks that Mr. Nixon and this hidden government has to handle, because I say Nazi, and that means white and Christian. And don't forget what Nazi means, I don't. You get the Mexican-American. And Mr. Chavez is the symbol of hope. He was a migrant himself. He worked from the time he was 10 years old picking vegetables and fruits. He had no formal education past high school. And he is the symbol for this young group that's just coming up. And Salazar was killed in L.A., and this man is the symbol, the hope of this whole group now.
Well, the symbol for this station is KLRB in Carmel. And you're listening to Dialogue Assassination with Mae Brussell.
Okay.
Okay, Mae, you were running down the reasons
why
behind the plot against Cesar Chavez's life.
Yes, as important in labor and important to the Mexican-American identity at this time. The third reason I think that Chavez is important is his closeness to the Kennedy family. Esquire came out with a new article yesterday. The entire issue practically is on Ted Kennedy, and he's on the cover. And the growing, gnawing question is, should he run or shouldn't he run? And there's pictures of him with his brothers and various people giving opinions. It's a gnawing question because you really don't know. The National Guild is such that he just could push the thing over. The two political parties are splintered. And the question is Teddy going to decide to run? And I feel, will he be pulled in at the convention because he is the only one who could beat Richard Nixon? And Richard Nixon knew it at the time of the Chappaquiddick accident. And I keep promising to do one whole show on Chappaquiddick, which we have to do. There's a book coming out called The CIA Frame-Up of Ted Kennedy at Chappaquiddick. And maybe he'll tell what happened before he decides to run. Maybe he won't. But if Ted decides to run, the closeness of the Kennedy family to Chavez is important. Robert Kennedy came out here and broke fast and sacrament with him after the strike, after the fast that Chavez had, and the Kennedy family's been very close to Cesar Chavez.
Ethel Kennedy was here in Salinas.
Ethel Kennedy was here in Salinas. And in the article on the assassination attempt on Chavez, it says that when Edward Kennedy learned that this informer had given the information out on who was going to kill him, he was instrumental in getting $10,000 paid to the informer to get more information. And I think the meeting of these lives is like the sinking of the Titanic or the saving of it at the iceberg meeting the ship. I feel that these lives are intertwined. If we have time, I wanted to read a poem called The Hangman, or maybe you could read it. I brought it in. The lives of these men running for political office or doing political things like Mr. Chavez, or related to those dead bodies in Dallas or in Arlington Cemetery, and he can't avoid them. Neither can Ted Kennedy. And Ted Kennedy has to know, that if Cesar Chavez is killed, he'll be killed. And if Mr. Chavez lives, Senator Kennedy could still be killed. But he has been instrumental in sending $10,000 to the informer to find out. So you know that he wants to preserve this life of Mr. Chavez, and I'm sure his own too. And we want to preserve them too. This is why I'm on the show. This is what it's
You
about.
haven't mentioned it, but would the mere fact that he is a Mexican-American, the racist implication there, would that also be a factor?
Well, no, not so much. I think we're learning to live with that if they're good Mexican-Americans.
That is, they keep their place and they don't try to make any impact on our...
Well, yeah, like Mr. Dimely up in Sacramento, who came out this week for Hubert Humphrey. He's safe. He doesn't need a bodyguard. There's nobody who's going to wipe Mr. You can be black and live in America, you know. Nobody's going to get you. It's just if you rock the boat. Mm-hmm. You know, if Mr. Dimely came out for Shirley Chisholm, then he may not get money to run the next campaign. That's where it's at. And you have to keep track of these fellows because you know who's safe and who isn't safe. It isn't your color anymore. It's who
your affiliations, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
A big difference between being a force in the NAACP and being a force in the Black Panthers.
Yeah, no, they're not just killing you if you're Mexican American anymore or black. It's something different. The fourth reason it would be necessary to kill Mr. Chavez is that he's difficult to duplicate. That men with charisma don't come along often. And even if he didn't have information on this hidden government or isn't even aware of it until maybe he hears this show or understands what is happening, he still is a danger to the free world because he has the charisma and he has the symbolism of nonviolence like Gandhi and Martin Luther King who were killed. And he's that kind of a person. There was an article in the LA Times this week, January the 5th, by David Bruckner. And it goes on to say, the purpose of the article is to say the civil rights movement is being repudiated all over the country. And I'm quoting the article now. He says, the Constitution is no guarantee of Supreme Court vigilance in terms of blacks. And within the movement, almost all the vivid leaders are gone. Whitney Young may have been the last activist who could have pulled all the disparate elements of the movement together. Young was one of those who could unite the people in a fight for new advances in rights. End quote. Well, Whitney Young is dead, and he's on my list, and I don't like the waves that knocked him down over in Africa, who he was with, because the same man that was with him when he died, Ramsey Clark, you know, the favorite of all the liberals today, was the man who got on the news media the day that Martin Luther King was killed and said it was lone assassin, no conspiracy, and they didn't have a shred of evidence to back that up. And that is
And there never was a trial in that case.
Never was, but there was the Attorney General telling it was a lone assassin, which is identical to McGeorge Bundy sitting in the war room at the White House and calling Lyndon Johnson, Air Force One, when he came home from Dallas, and saying it was a lone assassin, Oswald is the man. And this is documented in the December 71 issue of Computer and Automation, that McGeorge Bundy gave that information to Lyndon Johnson when the Dallas police hadn't even charged Oswald with the murder. And it came from the White House, McGeorge Bundy. So you have the same people doing the same song and dance in all of these murders. And this is why I rattled the names off, but I have documented speeches, phone calls, published documents that you can read if you want to see them. December 1971, Computer and Automation. It's an article on why the CIA killed John Kennedy, and it goes into the role of Asia and how 3 weeks after his death, 3 weeks after, the war escalated at a tremendous pace. And in researching how many people were killed in Vietnam or what the troops were doing, there was nothing noticeable in any movement of the Viet Cong in those 3 weeks to instigate an escalation. And McGeorge Bundy was in on this whole thing. He's named over and again by the researchers, but he gave the message to Lyndon Johnson that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. And that's the way it stayed from that day on.
Now, let's get back to the background
on Chavez.
Chavez.
Yeah, well, James Ray, and then the other reason that I have for believing that it's a high-level plot and not a local-level plot is that it is an election year. And to back that statement up, why it's important to kill Mr. Chavez in an election year, you'll have to go down to Memphis, Tennessee, and ask James Ray why Martin Luther King had to be killed in an election year. James Ray has said it was a conspiracy that had to be done in an election year. He was hired 18 months before. He was let out of a Missouri jail and went on his way and ended up in a motel in Memphis across from Lorraine Motel. Who decided it had to be an election year is the first question. Apropos of that, the Warren Report was completed. The orders were it had to be done before 64 an election year. I have letters of the commission members and lawyers to each other dated July, August, and even the first week in September, saying they didn't even have evidence on many, many of the things that they were going to put in the Warren Report. And yet the order was it had to be out in 64 election year. And 2 weeks later it went to print. And I have archived documents coming out of the National Archives that researchers have microfilmed and Xeroxed for me that show that they didn't even have answers to any of their questions in July and August, and it had to be printed in an election year. The third reason the election year is important is that Louis Tackwood, the informer for the LA Police Department, has claimed that he was hired to get radicals to plant bombs in the San Diego convention as an excuse to round up all the radicals. And if you get a man like Cesar Chavez killed, and the Mexican Americans get really violent or angry, they become, in quotes, radical, and you round them up. And the next reason is that the killings at Attica and of George Jackson have been linked to provocateurs. The LA Police Department, according to Louis Tackwood, had foreknowledge of the George Jackson killing. The purpose of ordering the guards and the prisoners slain in New York for Rockefeller's political ascendancy and so forth is linked to the violence and terror which you had in Nazi Germany, which leads to what this country wants to call chaos. The magic word for 68 elections was, quote, law and order. It brought you Spiro Agnew. You see, Agnew became vice president on the death of King because we needed law and order after those riots.
And that term, law and order, the first time I saw that in a political quote, it was attributed to Adolf Hitler in 1937.
That's right. Well, if you've read any articles on Spiro Agnew that are pro-Agnew, not anti-Agnew, that explain his ascendancy into the power he had, they attribute it to the death of King, that he became the great law and order man in Maryland because Brown had been there, Carmichael, and he put it all together. Agnew was carefully selected years before, but the excuse for him was law and order, and that was the bones of Martin Luther King. He ascended on that ladder, and I'm saying some pretty heavy things, but I feel that this can be documented, and it's their time to answer now. we've sat back and watched these things pile up, and I think it's time for people to get aware and to begin to write public officials. Before we wind up the show, I'm going to give you a few positive suggestions. I don't want to just throw out facts and information. I want you to begin acting. This is the year where people are taking their lives in their own hands, and we call it the year of the rat, remember? Mm-hmm. We're going to smoke them out and catch them. There's rat traps, there's rat poison. Rats spread disease, and they kill, and they bite infants when they're asleep at night, and they do a lot of pretty bad things, and there's cures for rats. We have an exterminator that comes to our house every month. Why can't we have them in the nation? And the Naders Raiders aren't exterminating them quite yet. We really need a group of people saying to Nader, we'll come on out and maybe see Mae Brussell. Let's really use it the year of the rat and smoke them out. Now, all the violence and terror that we call chaos will be created through the prolonged trials. Oh, Billy Smith was brought home on that fragging thing here, and they're stalling that off. That'll come at an election time. And Angela Davis's trial stalled along, all to build up for 72, the killing of Jackson and Attica. This is to make so much confusion and chaos that we will ask for protection and elect in the fascism. William Shire says we'll be the first country to elect it in. Germany elected in, and we have it, but we'll continue to give it the support, thinking it's a good father to us, a kind father. Now, the article on Chavez, I'm going to go to that. It was in the San Jose Mercury. If you want to go to your library and look it up, it was January the 2nd, and it's an excerpt from New York Times article by Earl Caldwell. And I read the article very carefully, and I linked it to the past murders for the following reasons. I'll give you 5 reasons. In the first place, the man who told about the intent to murder, the informer, was a young fellow who worked as an informer in the valley down near Bakersfield. He offered to work on narcotics and give information about narcotics among the farm workers, I guess, or people in the local area where he lived, and eventually somebody came to him and offered him some money to burn down an amusement park, and the man would collect the insurance, and this informer refused to do it, but the amusement park was burned down later anyway. And then they asked him to burn some records in Delano, and he realized that the records belonged to Cesar Chavez, and that the orders were to burn the offices and burn his papers, and they were to steal certain records from the Union files and then make a hit on Chavez and then hit him. Now, the way I read the article was that they were to hire 2 men. 2 men approached him. And one was a man wanted on a murder rap. He's in jail now. And the second man, they quickly put into jail. They planted narcotics on him and jailed him so he wouldn't surface. The newspaper article doesn't give you the names of the men, which is interesting. And this is another national kind of high-level conspiracy. They conceal the men. If it was a local thing, like in Salinas or Soledad or Gilroy, they'd tell you who the suspects are. If they say this man's in on a narcotics rap, they give you his name, or on a murder rap, they tell you the name. They don't tell you. They have one of the men who was to kill Chavez in jail now. He was wanted for murder in Kern County and Ventura County. They don't tell you who he was supposed to have murdered or what his name is. And it's the concealment of those names. It would make the news. If a man was murdered and later you jailed the suspect, it would make the news.
Well, certainly it would. You see that in the newspapers every day.
Every day. So why would you protect these men? Well, what I noticed was, in the first place, that one of the men was to do it was an I don't say an ex-convict, I say a man who was not caught yet, but who they had the information had committed a murder. And this is common practice, which I was not aware of. When I started political research and assassination, I was very naive. That men like James Ray was in jail, and he was approached, and his brother visited him that day, and the next day he was out, and the warden didn't call an alert for 24 hours, and James went on his merry course to spend $50,000 or $100,000 and have 3 passports, and it was a very interesting course until he ended up in Tennessee. But he was let out of jail, and if ever he was caught, he would then be put in for escaping, and the rap would be heavier, so they assure he'll be on the run, you see. And Manson was on parole. He was in Terminal Island and would have stayed longer, but he met with some really sharp cookies, and they hurried up his thing and his briefing, and he was on parole. So therefore, he's always subject to be taken in, and he has to behave himself, and this is common. And then the second thing that concerned me was the plan to hit the murderer after they hit Chavez. The plan that this man revealed, the informer, his name, the informer's name is here in the newspaper. I have to look it up here for you. Shears. He was to see that the man, after he killed Chavez, would be hit. Now that sounds a little bit like Ruby, who was
It
killed.
sounds like the Colombo murder also.
Exactly.
The murderer himself was killed, and they were not at all sure that it was the police who killed him.
And the son of Colombo has made statements, which I have, saying that the same people who killed Kennedy and King tried to kill my father. He's still in a coma. He said it's a CIA and FBI. It's an intelligence thing, and the purpose was to make the mafia fight each other. And this is why I think they're scrambling the offices of Chavez to make it look like the farm people are fighting Chavez to cover the motive, see. And Colombo has said the men who shot my father were the same people who killed Kennedy and King. And you had Ruby silenced with his 3 weeks cancer when he began to send out messages from the Dallas jail. He was killed. Oswald was killed. It's a common pattern. And Tackwood said that he quit the L.A. Police Department after 10 years of informing because he was to kill the radicals who would plant the bombs.
In other words, this gentleman, you say his name is Shears?
Shears, yes.
The informer. He was approached to kill the murderer.
Larry Shears, well, the way the article reads, Larry Shears was hired to first scramble, burn the papers in the offices, and then make a hit on Chavez that he knew the people who had killed. He wouldn't do the actual killing.
Right.
Yeah, he wouldn't do the killing. But he was to go into the offices and steal the records and Union files. And he claims the reason the assassination attempt has been held up is they didn't get into those offices yet. And I claim the reason they have to get to the offices is to scramble the motive of who would kill Cesar Chavez. It was necessary to mess up his offices first to make the motive look like it's the farm growers.
Well, now, the person who was to actually assassinate Cesar Chavez, was Larry Shears to hire him? Was he to make the contract, or was that being done outside of his...
Well, what he said at one time there was a threat on Chavez's life, and early in the fall there was an alleged plot, and I'm reading the article now. I authorized payment for an amount that would include to an informant. I understood the information wasn't necessary. Oh, this is Donald Bacon doing the investigation I'm reading. 2 key men, named by Shears as participants in the alleged plot, have been arrested on unrelated charges, and one is jailed. Neither was charged with organizing an assassination. One was arrested for murder. Because there has been no official action against any one of those mentioned by the informer, the names of the plot participants are withheld. Despite the arrest, leaders of the farm union are still worried. Shears said that his tapes and documents proved he worked with the federal agents, and the government authorized the payment of $10,000 for him as his role as an informer in the case. He went to the Narcotics Bureau and Treasury Department to get money to pay these men to check. You know, he was going to keep watch on them, but to see if it was real. He was to get money for these killers, evidently. He was involved in transferring the Treasury Department, sent out money to trap them, and he used to use that money for arson. It says he had a copy of a voucher showing the payment was made to him for information and evidence necessary to identify those persons, providing their names are withheld, and funds to arrange the arson and murder of Cesar Chavez. He has a canceled check for $500 issued through William Vizard, Special Investigator of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Enforcement Bureau. Shears said 3 years ago he was without work, worked in the Kern County Sheriff Department as an informer, and it was during this time that they approached him to go into the Delano offices, and then at that time they talked about that they were going to make a hit. He knows the men who were going to make the hit, but they don't expect him to do it. So he knew them, and he was offered this money first to burn the amusement park and then to burn the offices of Chavez. But
now, who was offering him the money to burn Chavez's office? The Treasury Department, you say?
No, a contact man. Early in the spring, a contact man who would be involved in the killing of Chavez offered him $5,000 if he would burn the records in Delano.
Well, then the Treasury Department was paying him as an informer.
Yes, $10,000 as an informer. He said if he blew his cover, then he would need guarantee because he'd have to leave the state after that, you see. No, the Treasury Department, the money that's coming in from Ted Kennedy through the Treasury Department is to get more information on this, but he refers to what he calls a contact man, offered him $5,000 to burn the records. And you see, I don't think if a man wanted to go out and shoot Cesar Chavez, and it wasn't a high-level, complicated plot, it wouldn't pass through all these hands. You see, to go all the way from where he was up to Delano to burn those records, they're scrambling the motive. This is the way I interpret it, you see, and this is why I put in a high-level conspiracy along with the others, because this man working with them, and they didn't know he was an informer, why they offer him the $5,000, why don't they just go up and scramble those offices? See, they got many people involved in the assassinations. There's many people involved, so it's the need-to-know basis again. See, these men could just go up and take that office themselves. If they're capable of killing, they're capable of burning that office or robbing it at night, just looking like a robbery, you see.
But in order to confuse the situation and make it less likely that you would track it down to who actually did it, why they hire a lot of unrelated people.
That's right. Hundreds of them. Yeah, hundreds of people passed through the hands of James Ray, many people, Lee Harvey Oswald and Manson, all of them. They go through complicated routes so that no one person is identifiable. So they go to a perfect stranger and offer him $5,000 to go up to Delano to scramble that office.
Well, now, can you tell us who you think or who you speculate is actually behind this alleged plot to kill Cesar Chavez?
Well, like I say in this book, The Inspection for Disarmament, or in my study of the killings of all these people and many more that I haven't even had time to mention, I feel there's a systematic removal of the leaders, of people who are working their way up in the social structure, who can effect changes in our society in an organized way, the same way that you would kill Jesus or Gandhi or all the other leaders who came along who captured the imagination of the people, who offered them a better life using the resources and minerals of the world to make it together. There's a systematic desire to keep the control of the wealth of the Congo or Asia in the hands, or South America in the hands of a few. The minerals and all the goodies, I call them the goodies of the world, and to keep the races pure, to keep the white Aryan tradition going. Hitler said he would live 1,000 years, and he could if we don't halt this. You see, Hitler is alive in the minds of these people. You see, the thing is, they have this cover story of they're going to have one man shoot him, and then another man will kill the man who kills him, and they'll burn the records. And Mr. Shears felt, it was his opinion, that the farm growers or somebody wanted to get Chavez, that it was a low-level plot. And I offer the theory based upon my research that it isn't low-level, that it's a high level. And just to show you how the federal government feels about Mr. Chavez, you remember when the grape strike was very bitter in the fall of the inauguration of Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, and it was that fall preceding the inauguration where there were the boycotts, who were very angry and so forth. And Spiro Agnew went to the point of decorating his inaugural ball with California grapes, if you remember. Now,
yes,
do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, what was it his business to get into this at the inauguration if he didn't tell you where his head is at, and if he isn't linked in all this? It was thoroughly disgusting at the time, and it came to my mind this week in thinking of all the federal places that came into this scene. And remember that when people weren't buying grapes at stores, boycotting through 2 summers, didn't have table grapes, and the controversy was very bad, the Pentagon went out of its way to buy more grapes than it ever did so that the grower wouldn't feel what the people were saying. If the people objected to the low wages and housing that the migrant farmers were getting and wanted to show our way of protesting, we say, well, what can the people do? What can you and I do?
Try to hurt them economically.
Yeah, I read that there's housing that the migrant farms have now that the people need. They're living in cars up in Castroville, Watsonville right now, and the housing is locked up, and they can't get any conditions open to get them into these houses in the winter, these families, until the crops grow. They're living in cars today. And the housing conditions in the camps are terrible. And when people began to really look into what Mr. Chavez was saying, they took some paint and painted the outside, and tried to structure some really nice housing for these workers. But the Pentagon had the last answer over us, because if we, the people, say at our own level, what can we do? Well, we are, wealthy, plump, big, fat pigs eating everything and using the earth, what the earth produces in the terms of produce and so forth, and we want to show that we want these people to have a better shape. We'll pay more for our produce, but they should have a decent wage or a decent standard of living, a place to live. When we show our protest and don't buy, the Pentagon bought more. So the federal government came right in and shipped to our boys in the service the finest grapes. So
they took up the slack, in other words, so that the grape growers would not feel the impact of the boycott.
That is documented. And I feel that the federal government is watching Mr. Chavez, and these are very terrible ways of saying we can handle your kind.
Okay, now Larry shares the two conspirators that he was in contact with, that his information came from, and that he's talking about. Both these gentlemen are in jail now.
Yes, they're both in jail. The two gentlemen are in jail, and there's been no official action taken about them. And they're sitting there. We don't know their names. I think that it would be interesting to know why. If one
are we certain they are in jail?
No, we're not certain of anything. We're not certain James Ray is sitting there either, unless you take your lives in your own hand. You're not certain. That's the point. Now, what can you do before we wind up? I think we should wind up with some suggestions. What can you do about you're posing
before we leave the subject, though, do you think there is still some danger to Cesar Chavez? Now, these two men have been arrested. Do you think there are more people involved, or perhaps these two men still are free and...
yes, there's always a danger to Cesar Chavez because of the reasons I mentioned. He is a man of brilliance and charisma. He's put it together. He's unselfish. He's disciplined, and he understands people and people's needs, and he'll always be in danger.
Well, there is a plot that has been uncovered, obviously, and has been documented. Do you think this plot has been blown now, has been defused, and this particular plot has been rendered ineffective, or do you think it's still on?
Let's put it this way, Bob. The purpose of my talking about that today on the show is this. Number one, hopefully to save a life. That no one ever on the radio, like we said before, has ever spoken about how a murder would take place or who would do it before it took place. That there are gunmen who make a hit, and then there's somebody behind the scenes that I can't name who's going to kill the hitman. Who is he? Where does he move? How does he live? Who pays him? You see, who's planning all this? Who's protecting the names of the people that are arrested, and why are they protected if they've been caught, with this plot? I think we have to help Mr. Chavez by asking questions about the past political murders. I would say that Mr. Chavez and his lawyers, if they want to protect their lives, would get in touch, say, with Bernard Fensterwald and the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. And Bernard is the attorney for James Ray. And maybe through Ted Kennedy, promise amnesty to James Ray. Let him have the money that's in the Swiss bank that we know he has. Let him get to Rhodesia, where he wants to go, in exchange for telling us who wanted to kill Martin Luther King in an election year. And ask, is Cesar Chavez going to be the sacrificial lamb of the 72 election? This is what I fear. Let him go to a committee that exists of members, a man from Harvard Law School, cum laude from Harvard, who's written law books, who went to Europe and studied in England, and is a knowledgeable man studying these things. I'm Mae Brussell, a researcher, but there's documented people, accredited people in the legal profession who know what I know, and I think he should go to Washington and sit with Fensterwald and see James Ray and say, I'm Cesar Chavez, and I want to know who killed Martin Luther King and why you say it's a conspiracy. And maybe then Mr. Chavez could live.
Okay, we have about another minute, Mae, and I promise to repeat the address and telephone number, and also I think it would be a good idea to repeat the details on that book, and we'll assume that everyone has, at some time during the past hour, gotten hold of a pencil and something to write on. If you want to write to Mae Brussell, address your correspondence in care of KLRB, Box 3904, Carmel, California. Our zip code is 93921. If you want to speak to Mae, as I say, you call KLRB and leave your name and telephone number. We'll pass that on to Mae, and she does return the calls. Our telephone number is 624-3859. And the book you were recommending today, Mae?
Inspection for Disarmament by Seymour Melman, Columbia University Press. And the movie I recommend is Millhouse, the white comedy, too. It's playing in town now, and I wish all the students listening and everyone in the area within my voice see it. It isn't a comedy, it's a tragedy. And the joke is on you out there. It's not on Richard Nixon. It's on us.
Millhouse, and that's playing at local theaters now. We might do a whole program on that, I think.
I would like to, yes.
Thank you, Mae Brussell, and for KLRB, I'm Bob Barron.